Okay, so today we're going to talk about Islamic art. If I can get my thing to go into present mode, there we go. So you should have already watched the recordings if you're in my class. If you're not in my class, you can watch whatever you want. But if you're in my class, in my Art History 1 class, you should have already watched the lectures on the Byzantine era. And so when we talk about the Islamic world, we're going to talk about things that happen concurrently to the Byzantine world and then things that go on a little bit afterwards. But one of the things about the Survey Art History class is I have to talk about a lot of things that were happening in different areas at the same time, which you've already encountered when we've been talking about some of the earlier things. But basically everything in Europe gets kind of complicated as we're going into the Middle Ages, which is our next section. We're going to talk more about medieval Europe from another perspective. So this kind of goes along concurrently, if you look at the dates, with some of the stuff that we talk about in the Byzantine era, and you'll see a lot of mutual influence between what's happening in the Islamic world in terms of art and architecture and what was happening in the Byzantine. Okay, so to get us situated in what we were talking about, this isn't just one region, it's several regions, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but the common factor that's influential in a lot of these areas is the religion of Islam. So the religion of Islam arose in Arabia early in the 7th century, just to put you in a timeline, kind of where we are. And the Prophet Muhammad begins receiving God's revelations at this time, okay? And this is what this religion is based on. At this point, the Arabic people were not major players on the world stage in terms of the Western European world that we've been talking about a lot in this class. But within only like a century, the followers of Islam kind of dominate the Middle East, and they take over a lot of the Eastern Mediterranean in Europe, which had previously been under the reign of the Byzantine emperors. And then by 640, Muslims rule Syria, Palestine, and Iraq. In 642, the Byzantine army abandoned Alexandria, which leaves Egypt open to Muslim conquest. In 651, Islamic forces ended more than 400 years of Sasanian rule in Iran, so they take over where the Sasanians had ruled for a long time in Iran. By the year 710, all of northern Africa is under Islamic rule, which had previously been ruled by different empires, like at its height, the Byzantine and the Roman empires, right? By 732, Muslim forces had reached Poitiers, France, but they were defeated by the Franks under the rule of a guy named Charles Martel. And I tell you his name because in our next segment, we're going to talk about his grandson, who is the very famous Charlemagne. So Charlemagne's granddad, Charles Martel, was ruling the Franks, and he was able to beat back and defeat the Muslim forces. In contrast to that, however, in Spain, the Muslim rulers of Cordoba flourish until 1031, and Islamic influence in the Iberian Peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula is Spain and Portugal, right? That chunk of Europe that kind of sticks out to the west. So the Iberian Peninsula continues under the Islamic influence until 1492. 1492 might be a familiar year to you if you're an American. We, in elementary school, learned that little rhyme in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So in 1492, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand II overthrow the Muslim rulers in Granada, which we'll talk about Granada quite a bit toward the end of this lecture. And so Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand sponsor Columbus, Christopher Columbus's exploration of the New World. So if that sounds familiar, that time and those rulers, that's probably why you remember that. A lot of things about this discovering the New World, because Amerigo Vespucci discovered it before him, and of course the Native Americans were there long before that. Anyway, that's not what this topic is. Okay. And then in Anatolia, it's only in Anatolia, which is what's modern-day Turkey, that there's stubborn Byzantine resistance, right? So this kind of slows down the dominance of the Islamic conquest in Eastern Europe. Finally, the Muslim forces defeat the Byzantines and end the Byzantine rule, and that happens in 1453, which I talked about at the end of the last Byzantine lecture, but we'll talk about it a little bit here as well. And thus begins the Ottoman Empire, right, which is pretty famous. However, I started off with all of this because I do think it's important, but military conquest alone does not account for the far-reaching sweep of Islam from Arabia to India to northern Africa and to Spain. So let's look at a couple of maps. You know at this point in the semester how much I like maps. So this is when the Byzantine Empire is still standing. So in green you have what's left of the Byzantine Empire. And then in purple, you see the Umayyad Caliphate. So we're going to go in, and I have a little graphic here in a minute to tell you about the different caliphates. Those are the different, so a caliph is a Muslim ruler. So the caliphates are the different kind of kingdoms. They're the different kind of areas of rule, right? Okay, kind of like provinces. Anyway, so the Umayyad Caliphate is in purple here. And then we have the Byzantine Empire. Then we see when the Byzantine Empire falls, like I was just talking about, in 1453, which you may remember from the last lecture. Then we see all of this green. This is the Islamic world after the capture of Constantinople from the Byzantines in 1453 and the fall of Granada to the Christians in 1492. So there's this kind of switch up where they get the Muslims kind of take over all of Turkey, but they do lose Spain kind of right around the same time. Okay, so we have all of this switch up from military might, obviously military conquest, but that's not the only thing. That doesn't account for the far-reaching sweep of Islam, again from Arabia to India to North Africa to Spain. The Islamic faith appealed strongly to millions and millions of people and still does today. There are millions of practitioners, and there were at this time as well. Islam remains one of the most popular religions today, so it's a long-going, widespread influence. There are Muslims on all continents, and it's had a huge cultural impact, obviously, right? It is a major influence around the globe in many ways, but we're mostly interested in the art and architectural inspirations and tracing how that influence impacts some of the other cultural developments down the road as well, because all of this stuff kind of comes together and is interconnected in a lot of ways. Outside of the worlds of art and architecture, Arab scholars laid the foundation for arithmetic. The numbers we use in the West are Arabic numerals. I don't know if you know that, but like our 1, 2, 3, 4, those are Arabic numerals. So there's some influence there that's pretty far-reaching just in terms of basic language and how things are written. The number system we use today is, of course, the Arabic number system. Algebra, astronomy, medicine, the natural sciences, all would not be what they are today without the contributions of Muslim scholars that started around this time period. During the 12th and 13th centuries, Christian scholars in the West studied Arabic translations of Aristotle and other Greek scholars. Arabic love lyrics inspired the French troubadours and other famous poets, romance poets. During the early centuries of Islamic history, the Muslim world's political and cultural center was the Fertile Crescent, which we talked about very early in the semester. If you go back to the Neolithic lectures, one of them is about the Fertile Crescent. And that's where like Mesopotamia and Babylon and these kind of places were, where the Assyrians came from. So the Muslim caliphs expand outward from the Fertile Crescent and take over a lot of other regions. Like other conquerors, they were also builders on a grand scale. So we've seen this over and over again, right? When we looked at Octavian Augustus, as he made the Roman Empire bigger and bigger, he built lots of things as he went to spread the culture and the style, right? To kind of claim it in some ways. We still can see Muslim architecture in Northern Africa, in Spain, in Central Asia, as well, of course, as in the Middle East. Okay, so let's do a quick rundown of the history and then we'll look at some art. So from 622 to 756, we have Muhammad abandoning Mecca for Medina. The Umayyads are the first Islamic dynasty, and you'll hear about them a lot because they do a lot in the Middle East where they originate, but they're also very prominent in Spain. And then we also see the construction of the Great Mosque in Damascus. From 756 to 1453, we have the Abbasids producing the earliest Qurans with Colphic calligraphy, and we'll look at some of that Colphic calligraphy. The Spanish Umayyad dynasty builds the Great Mosque in its capital at Cordoba, which is an incredible space, and we'll spend some time talking about that. The Nasrids construct magnificent palaces in Alhambra, which is also in Spain, and we'll look at that. That's in Granada. And then we have more dynasties developing a lot of lavish art patrons around the world in places like Egypt. From 1453 to 1924, the Ottomans captured Byzantine Constantinople, of course, in 1453 and developed the domed central plan mosque, which has a lot of influence from buildings like Hagia Sophia. The Timurid book illumination flowers under Hussein Bakara. And then we also see the manufacture of more mosaic tiles and different kinds of mosaic tile work. Okay, so this is just a helpful key. If you go back to the PDF of this, if you're in my class, if you're confused about who's ruling what when, this is just a little key that has some of the major dynasties, where they were and the dates that they ruled, because I find that kind of thing sort of helpful. So this is major Muslim dynasties for your reference. Okay, let's look at some art. So, the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is a very important center for a lot of different religions, obviously, right? And one interesting thing, which I'm sure most of you know, is that Islam, Judaism, and Christianity they worship the same God. They have the same kind of origin story and some of the same figures from what Christians call the Old Testament, Jewish people call the Torah, and we see the early books of the Quran. So some of the sites that are holy sites are holy to all three religions, and this is one of them. The Dome of the Rock is over one of them. So this is built in Jerusalem in 687, between 687 and 692. The Muslims captured Jerusalem in 638. And this is kind of some of the first great Islamic buildings are erected between 687 and 692 by the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik. So he rules from 685 to 705, and he's a great patron of the arts. He's particularly interested in architecture and in building architecture in really key areas around key holy sites. So this is structurally a really interesting building because it's an octagon with a dome on top of it. So unlike some of the domed buildings we've looked at before, which is either a cruciform with a dome over the crossing, or simply a drum, like a cylindrical building with a dome over the top, like the Pantheon, this is a octagonal shape, so we haven't really seen that before. Though there's some similarities to some of the central plan stuff we saw coming out of the pre and early Byzantine in Rome and Ravenna, if you look back at that lecture. But they weren't octagonally shaped, really. So this is an octagon with a dome. Some vocabulary words. Caliph, you're going to see that word a lot. That's a leader of a Muslim community, particularly a caliphate, a large region usually. The Umayyad can refer to a person who's a member of the Muslim dynasty that ruled the Islamic world from AD 660 to 750, and Moorish Spain from 756 to 1031. The dynasty claimed descent from Umayyah, who was a distant relative of Muhammad. So that's where the name comes from, but this is they're a pretty prominent dynasty in terms of their patronage of the arts, so you're going to hear a lot. This is inside the Dome of the Rock, and there are a couple different things that I want you to take note of. First of all, this has some Byzantine vibes, right? So we have lots and lots of gold, we have mosaic work, we have a dome that has fenestration, it has windows all the way around the barrel of the dome, so we have light coming in. We have stained glass, which we haven't really seen yet, and we have this highly ornate, abstract gold kind of heavenly, otherworldly kind of look. One of the things that you'll notice in Islamic art that Islamic artists and patrons have in common with the iconoclasts, if you remember the iconoclasts from the Byzantine, is they do not believe it is proper, they actually think it's blasphemous to create images of their holy figures. So in an Islamic religious building, like a mosque, you would never see, for example, an image portraying Muhammad or an image portraying God, or you wouldn't see any human figures or anything like that at all. In some personal small-scale works, you'll see secular figures or sometimes animals, but generally you just see designs based on vegetation, designs based on architecture, abstract work, and then a lot of really lovely fluid kind of calligraphy. A lot of writing, okay, is part of the design. So it's a lot of interesting work in abstraction. Okay, I think this is a really fantastic graphic that I found. So this is a helpful thing to see. It kind of breaks down a lot of the different aspects of the Dome of the Rock. One of the things that I want to talk about is just, why is this called the Dome of the Rock? Why is it placed here? What is this rock that it's placed on top of? So the rock that the Dome of the Rock is built on, and the reason it's in the location that it is it's built over the foundation stone. So this is an important site for Christians, Jews, and Muslims. And so basically the foundation stone, if you look in this image, is the stone that's in the middle. It's right under the dome. It's what everything is built around. And it's the site of an important story from the Old Testament and the Torah and the Quran. And that is where Abraham, so Abraham is a figure in the Old Testament, and God wants to test his faith, essentially. So he says, Abraham, I'm going to need you to kill your son. I'm going to need you to sacrifice your son, Isaac. And so this foundation stone, this rock, is where supposedly Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac. It's also considered by Jewish tradition to be the point where heaven and earth meet, which is pretty significant. On the surface of the stone, there are various artificial human-made cuts. And so there's been some damage which has been caused by the Crusaders. We'll talk about the Crusaders a little bit later. And then there's also this large hole that reaches to the Well of Souls below. Okay, so that's another part of the mythos behind this rock. That is why we have the Dome of the Rock. The Well of Souls is also called the Holy of Holies in Christianity and Judaism. And it's part natural and part man-made. It's a cave, basically. It's this kind of opening down below this foundation stone. And basically the idea is that there are spirits of the dead like hanging out there waiting for Judgment Day. So it's not a well like a well of water. That's why it's called a Well of Souls. So you can see why this is a very holy site in Jerusalem for Muslims, Christians, and Jews. So the Muslims have built this fantastic structure around it that's kind of, it's not exactly a mosque, it's really more of like a shrine protecting this specific foundation stone. So it's a little bit of a unique kind of structure. And it's largely not been damaged, even though it's in Jerusalem and it's this highly contested holy site for all these religions, because it's a holy site and people don't want to injure it, basically. So it's pretty interesting. So we have that octagonal central plan design, which is something that we see more and more of as we look at mosque design and construction. And then we have this dome that's fenestrated, like the dome at Hagia Sophia, and we see that being a popular design in early Islamic architecture. Here's the other kind of popular floor plan or layout of Islamic holy buildings in early Islamic art, but also kind of continues through into later Islamic art in some instances as well. This is the Great Mosque of Damascus. Damascus, of course, is in Syria. You all know this. This has sustained some damage in recent years, unfortunately, which is a huge bummer. If you look at this, I like this shot from above because I think it kind of tells us a little bit about the history of the building, and it also makes it easy to see the floor plan and compare it to some of the other kinds of structures that we've looked at this semester. So when I look at this, it makes me think of the Romans. It makes me think of the Forum with the Basilica, which, remember, in Roman times, a basilica was not a religious building. It was a secular building. It was an administrative building. But you see this colonnade that goes along this courtyard, and then we have this building that's very prominent next to it. To me, it kind of looks like a Roman forum with either a Roman basilica or a slightly oddly laid out Roman temple to the side of it that's been sort of reoriented. Other things that you can notice looking at this is it sort of looks like the basilica format churches that we were looking at in the early Byzantine, and that we'll look at lots and lots of when we talk about the Romanesque soon. So you can see this structure is sort of, could be construed as the nave, and we have kind of a transept, we have a dome over the crossing, but you'll notice there's these three kind of wavy different roofs in here, so we know that this isn't quite the basilica Roman cross format of a church that we're used to. So, well, it's not a church, that's why. You'll also notice these three towers around the outside. Those are called minarets. We're going to see a lot of minarets. That is a vocabulary word that you should write down if you're in my class, because it will be on your quiz. So if you see a building and it has a dome and it has 1 to 5 of these tower thingies on the side, that is probably a mosque, or was a mosque at one time. So we'll see several of these buildings have had a little identity crisis over the years. Okay, let's look closer at this thing. So this is the Great Mosque in Damascus. It's pretty fantastic looking. And this is built by the Umayyads. Remember I said we were going to talk about the Umayyad dynasty quite a lot. They're great patrons of the arts. So basically the Umayyads decide to transfer their capital from Mecca to Damascus in Syria. I do not remember why. I'm sure that you could look that up. But anyway, in 661, they moved the capital of their caliphate from Mecca to Damascus, which is in Syria. The caliph at the time is Al-Walid, and he buys a Byzantine church. So at this point, the Byzantine Empire is shrinking backwards a little bit. And this is Leo III times. Remember Leo III, the iconoclast guy. So anyway, Caliph Al-Walid purchases this Byzantine church that had formerly, before that, been a Roman temple to Jupiter. So when I was talking about this having some sort of Roman vibes, that's not by accident. The Umayyads tear down the Byzantine church, but they decide to keep the Roman precinct walls. So they keep some of the original walls around the outside, and they copy some of this kind of arcing colonnade kind of Roman architecture. These are these 3 minarets that I pointed out, the towers that were used to call people to prayer, so that's what they're for. Those are the earliest minarets in the Muslim world, which is kind of a big deal. So we have this really interesting structure that has all of these different sort of origins coming together. So we have Roman influence, we have Byzantine influence, and then we have the Islamic world kind of finding their voice and what their architectural language is going to look like. Let's look at this a little bit. So here's the plan. So it's kind of interesting. You can see relationships to a basilica. The side aisles and the nave are all the same width, because it's not really a nave, it's a prayer hall. But you do have a kind of crossing. You have this kind of area that looks like it could be a transept with a dome over it. And you have this sort of atrium or courtyard area. Then look at all the mosaic work. So this could be mosaic work in a Byzantine church. If you just showed me these arches and nothing else, I'd be like, well, that's interesting. You've got some Roman capitals. Those are late Corinthian capitals. And then on top, you have these interesting Byzantine looking mosaics coming off the springings into the arch from the colonnade. You've got this double colonnade, which is a little unusual for Byzantine. It kind of looks almost Romanesque, which is later. So there's a lot of shared influence between all these cultures. This is just a close-up on one of the mosaics. So as I said, you don't have depictions of holy figures. That's a big no-no in Islam. So you don't have any human figures in holy sites. You also don't have animals, but you do have vegetation and you have architecture. And this to me looks a lot like second style Roman painting, which we looked at a lot of examples of from Pompeii, if you remember. So it's the idea of architecture, but the perspective's off and it's a little bit fantastical. I've always thought that a lot of these early Islamic mosaics look a lot like that early second style Roman painting, so it's kind of interesting. very beautiful, very intricate process to do all that mosaic work. Okay, this is one of my favorite things that we look at in the Islamic period, because I think it's just kind of cute what it's named. So it's the Malwiya minaret. So it's kind of funny because it's not like a typical minaret, which are those tower things around mosques that people go up and do the call to prayer from. This is this tower, it was part of the Great Mosque at Samarra, but it's kind of its own standalone weird structure. It's not functional as a minaret, it's too tall. You can't hear anyone yelling from the top of it. And it's much larger than most minarets. It's very wide, it has this wide base, and it has this spiral that goes all the way up, which is where it gets its name. So Malwiya is the Arabic word for snail shell. So it's called this because it sort of looks spirally like a snail shell, which I think is cute. So I think it's kind of neat. It's very interesting looking. At the time of its construction, the Great Mosque at Samarra in Iraq was the largest mosque in the world. It was 45,000 square feet, which is quite large. It's built between 848 and 852 or 4, I think 52. And this particular structure, this Malwiya minaret, the snail minaret, is the inspiration for a lot of medieval European, mostly painters who did illuminated manuscripts, for the Tower of Babel. So the Tower of Babel is something from, I think, one of the non-canonical books of the Old Testament. It's people who were building the tower to try and reach heaven, to try and reach God. And so this little spiral-shaped tower, a lot of people who were doing illuminated manuscripts in the Middle Ages thought that this was a good sort of design, I guess, for the stand-in for this story of the Tower of Babel. So when we look at illuminated manuscripts, when we get into medieval Europe in the next lecture, keep that in mind. It's also, this has been damaged. Samarra has had a lot of fighting forever, and there's a lot of damage here. It's not very well preserved. There's some graffiti. It's kind of a bummer, but super rad building. Okay, now we're going to talk about the mesquita, which I'm going to spend a little more time talking about this than I have particularly about any of the other buildings, because it's one that I think is important to make a study of for its kind of contributions to what comes to be the defined, the hallmarks of the style of Islamic architecture. So mesquita, you might notice, does not sound like an Arabic word. That is because mesquita is not a Arabic word, it is a Spanish word. So this is the Great Mosque of Cordoba, Spain. And Cordoba should have an accent on that first O. I don't know how to do that on a PC. I'm a Mac user and I haven't figured it out yet. So apologies to Spanish-speaking people that I left an accent off Cordoba. Okay, so the mesquita is in Cordoba, Spain. And it's now, in present day, the Cathedral of Our Lady of the Assumption. So it's a cathedral now, which I told you, some of these things have kind of flip identities depending on who's in charge in the region. According to traditional accounts, which have been challenged by some scholars now, but a lot of the original legend was that there was a Visigothic church called the Basilica of St. Vincent of Saragossa that was originally on the site. So that wouldn't be that unusual. A lot of these holy sites have been holy sites for the previous people, and then the new people who come in and conquer take them over and put their holy site there. It's kind of like converting people based purely on habit, like they were used to going to the church in the spot, so they'll just start going to the mosque, is some of the idea to kind of, it's almost like a conversion based on inertia. Anyway, we'll talk about the Visigoths in the next lecture. They're pretty interesting. Toward the end of their reign, they largely convert to Christianity and build some very odd churches. So we'll look at some of those. Not very many of them are still standing, but we have some reconstructions. Anyway, so the Great Mosque is built by Abd ar-Rahim I in 785. And at the time, Cordoba was the capital of the region called Al-Andalus. Okay, so this region, which is most of the Iberian Peninsula, which is where Spain and Portugal are, is Al-Andalus, and then the capital is Cordoba. Okay, so this caliphate, who is one of the Umayyads, is Abd ar-Rahman I, and he's kind of the, he's the leader of this whole region. So he builds this mosque. The mosque was expanded multiple times. Abd ar-Rahman III added a minaret in 958, so this is another early minaret. And his son, al-Hakam II, added a very richly decorated mihrab and a maksura section, both in 971. So, little vocabulary break. A mihrab, M-I-H-R-A-B, is a sort of niche. It's like a little concave area that sometimes has a little kind of arch over it. It's usually very richly decorated. Sometimes, like in this instance, and we'll look at this one more closely, it's a whole kind of little section, almost like an apse in a church that has a dome and everything. But its purpose is it symbolizes the direction for prayer. So in Islam, you're supposed to pray toward Mecca. You have to pray in a certain direction. And the job of the mihrab in an architectural structure is to show you which way that is. So it's kind of your orienting spot. A maksura, M-A-Q-S-U-R-A, is an area reserved for like the caliph or the emir during prayer. So it's kind of like, I don't know what the Western equivalent is. It's like box seating, I guess. It's kind of like a reserved special VIP seating for the rulers of the time. And it's often highly decorated as well. So we're going to look at some of these spaces because they're generally pretty interesting looking. Okay, so just to fill in the rest of the history of this building, it's converted to a cathedral in 1236. And that's when Cordoba is overtaken by Castile, by the Christian forces from the Castile. This is a period called the Reconquista, which is a Spanish word, obviously. It's, if you've heard of conquistadors, conquerors, right? People who kind of like Spanish knights, sort of. So the Reconquista are, these people are coming back to take back Moorish Spain from the Muslims and reclaim it in the name of Christianity, whatever. Okay. The interior was described by Muhammad Iqbal, he's a much later, I think he's a 19th century famous writer and philosopher, and he described the interior as countless pillars like rows of palm trees in the oasis of Syria, and the beauty of the mosque was so dazzling that it defied description. So it's always good to have some quotes from writers who really know how to describe things beautifully. It's a rectangular prayer hall with aisles perpendicular to the Qibla, that's the area in front of the mihrab, and it's a hypostyle hall. So let's take a peek at this. So this is the main prayer hall. Hypostyle hall should sound familiar to you if you're in my class, or if you're a random internet person who's just been watching all of these videos, because in the lecture on Egypt, when I talk about a guy called Ramses II, he's kind of an important guy, the last warrior pharaoh of Egypt, he started designing things, having his people design these hypostyle halls. It's basically a hall that has is supported by lots and lots of rows of columns, okay? And the Muslim designers loved this idea of these hypostyle halls, and they become quite a popular design for prayer halls in mosques. So in this particular one, we have 850 columns, and you'll notice the coloration of the columns and of the double arches over them. We're going to talk about those double arches some more. But these are not painted. They're actually made out of jasper, onyx, marble, and granite. So the columns are dark because they're onyx. The striped alternating patterns in those arches look like that because they're marble and jasper. Okay, so that's not something that's painted. That's not something that's ever going to fade. Color striping is very common in Umayyad architecture. This idea of these Moorish arches are their own very distinctive kind of version of the Umayyad color alteration. So Umayyad in the Middle East, they like this color alteration that creates this kind of striping pattern, but this the kind of orangey red with the white like this is very distinctive to the Spanish Umayyad Caliphate, which is sometimes called the Moorish style. These repeating double arches, where we have arches on top of each other, are considered one of the most innovative architectural systems in European history. and they've been the subject of a lot of scholarly commentary. There are a lot of papers about these arches. I think it's really fantastic. So looking at this thing, it always looks to me a little bit like it's some kind of optical illusion, like it's a hall of mirrors or something. And part of that is from the stripes, because that's a little bit disorienting. And the other part is that they're arches stacked on top of each other. It's double arch, double arch, double arch, double arch. And then we have all of these rows of columns. So it's pretty dizzying. It's this kind of interesting design that's one of the very influential things that comes out of Cordoba and the Mesquita. Okay, so let's look at the dome in front of the mihrab. So this is a dome that kind of marks the area right before the mihrab, which is the niche that tells you which direction to pray. And it's super interesting. First of all, when we were talking about the Romans, we talked about groin vaults, which is where two barrel vaults cross, right, and make that kind of more structurally sound groin vault. Well, this is like a groin vault on steroids. Look at all those crisscrosses. The way that those arches are intersecting and supporting each other, it automatically builds these little squinches, the kind of rounded triangle spaces, which we talked about with Hagia Sophia, that help support the dome. We also have an octagonal base for this dome, and then around the dome shape itself, we have this weird polylobed kind of form that we've not really seen before. Another thing is if you look in the corner and the arches under here, those are also polylobed arches, P-O-L-Y-L-O-B-E-D, meaning that instead of just a smooth arch like a Roman arch, we have all these little kind of mini arches within the arch. That's called polylobed arches. That's important. That's one of the signature Islamic architectural styles. Okay, we also have horseshoe arches, so under, like around that window between those two squinches, you see how it kind of goes in like this and then comes up to the arch. That's a horseshoe arch. That's another thing that's a hallmark of Moorish and Islamic style. So these are very influential elements that we're seeing here. Okay, let's see. Let's now look at some things beyond architecture. So far we've just been talking about architecture. So let's look at some smaller scale items and talk a little bit more about what art looks like outside of just the architecture in the early Islamic period. So this is a pixis. Pixis is a great Scrabble word. You've got a Y and an X in there. This particular pixis belonged to someone named Al-Maghira. So I like this. I like this word, pixis, because I think it's an interesting word. It just means a jar with a lid. It's just a word for a jar with a lid. That's all it is. In the case of these pixis from this time period, they're special. They're carved out of ivory. They're very highly, elaborately carved and decorated. And they were owned by members of the royal family, and they kept precious things in them. So this was what you would keep your gemstones in, or your jewelry, or your perfume, or your exotic incense. So very special things were kept in this. We don't know what was kept in this particular one. Also, that hinge would not have been there. That was added probably in the 15th or 16th century, but it just would have sat on top of it. It wouldn't have been hinged, and you can partially tell that because it's interrupting the inscription around the top there. It is carved out of ivory, very expensive. This particular one is in the collection at the Louvre in Paris. It comes from the royal workshop of Abd al-Rahman III and was probably a gift for his son. It's engraved with the name of the person it belonged to, and the reason I say probably is because his son's name was actually slightly different than this. His son was Abd al-Madarif III. So the scholarly thought is that Al-Maghira was kind of a pet name for him. So it's kind of a nickname for the son, but it's the last son of the Caliph, Abd al-Rahman III. So he's the one who added on to the mesquita. Okay, so we know it's his because it's engraved around the base, which again, not the base, engraved around the base of the lid, which is interrupted by this fastener thing that's been added later. And what it says is, blessings from God, goodwill, happiness, and prosperity to al-Maghira, son of the commander of the faithful. May God's mercy be upon him. Made in the year 357. So one of the nice things about calligraphy being one of the main decorations is that we have lots of information from this. So when you see calligraphy like that on something, it's generally telling us something about the history of the object, which is pretty rad. It's interesting, it's very intricately carved, and within that there are these four main kind of medallion, polylobed medallion type forms. So I'm going to tell you what is in these medallions. The first one shows two men gathering eggs from falcon nests. Naturally, what else would you have on there? And that is apparently a popular symbol for Umayyad power, this gathering of eggs from falcon nests. The second medallion has two horse riders picking dates, like the fruit, picking dates from a date palm. And this alludes to the homeland in the Middle East, which is where the date palm grows, so where the Umayyads came from. Medallion 3 we have depicted here. This is this upper right one. So this is a musical court scene. So we have these two seated figures, and in the middle we have a figure who has some kind of instrument that they're playing. That's probably a servant musician who's playing music for the two seated figures. And so the meaning of this has been kind of hotly debated. There's a lot of different ideas about it, but one thought is that the guy with the scepter and the flask is maybe the caliph, and the figure with the fan, the kind of thing with a sprout at the top, the palm fan, maybe represents the Abbasids. Those are the people who basically massacred the Umayyads in the Middle East, and then the surviving members fled to Spain and founded the Umayyad Caliphate in Spain. I don't know, there's a couple of different ideas about what this might be. Some people think it might be some sort of coming of age ritual that's being depicted. It's not as well known. And then my favorite of the medallions is the one over here that you can see on this jar. It's the fourth medallion, and it shows a bull and a lion. It shows two bulls and two lions fighting. And so the lions are on top and the bulls are underneath. It's hard, when I read that those were bulls, I had to really look at them, but they are. And many consider this to be a symbol of the power and legitimacy of Umayyad rule in Spain. So lions we see back in Persian art and Assyrian art and some of this other art from the Middle East as the symbol of the people coming from there, this powerful symbol. And so then the bull is very associated with Spain and the Iberian Peninsula and Spanish culture. So it's this idea of the lion conquering the bull, right? Okay, let's look at some other things. So this is, we know who made it. His name was Suleiman because it is signed. So we know the name of the artist. And this is a ewer. A ewer is just like a jug or a pitcher. And it's in the form of a bird. And I just like it. I think it's kind of lovely. So we don't see animals or humans depicted inside mosques. So we don't see holy figures depicted inside mosques or any humans or animals, because that's not okay. But for personal use items and just secular depictions, that is okay. So we have this ewer, which just looks like a little statue, but out of its mouth and the little holes on either side of its beak, liquid can pour, okay? So it's brass, it's cast brass, and it has silver and copper inlay. It's 1 foot 3 inches high. It's now at the Hermitage. And I just think it's pretty rad. It's a really nice example of early Islamic brass work, which is something that becomes highly affiliated with Islamic small-scale sculptural and decorative work from this time. Okay. Another thing is, we talked about illuminated manuscripts a little bit with the Byzantines, and we'll talk about them more when we talk about medieval Christian Europe, which is the next segment after Islamic art. And so the pages of the Quran are also illuminated. There are also illuminated manuscripts of the Quran. So this one, we can see the beautiful calligraphy in the inkwork. This is called Gothic script, which is kind of stately and very kind of rectilinear looking. And then you can see that just like in the other illuminated manuscripts we were looking at, there's gold leaf. So we have all this decorative kind of abstracted patterns, and then we have this palm finial at the end, and that's all picked out in gold. So this is an important kind of tradition, calligraphy and the gilt work, gilt being the application of gold leaf. It becomes an important thing in the artistic history of Islam as well. Lastly, I want to look at this ceramic piece. So writing is one of the main forms of decoration, as we've seen in early Islamic art, continuing through later Islamic art. And as you can see in the ceramic dish, this kind of very simplified, sort of elegant script around the outside is the only decoration on this dish. This is again in Colphic calligraphy, and what it says is, knowledge, although bitter at first taste, is ultimately sweeter than honey, good health, which seems like a good thing to be on a dish. That's an Arabic proverb. So potters in Nishapur, Iran, which is where this is from, and Samarkand, Uzbekistan, developed this very simple but elegant type of glazed dish with just a simple calligraphy design around the outside. This kind of work is highly collectible and sought after today, and it is called, collectively, it's just kind of called Samarkand ware, which refers to the work from Nishapur as well. So this kind of using calligraphy as an element of decor extends from grand mosques all the way to secular things like ceramic plates. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and next we'll talk about later Islamic art.